Why would a well-dressed man with soft eyes and a steady voice murder his favorite teacher? Harold Francis Landon III stood motionless in court hands, folded lips trembling, not from fear but from some deeper tremor beneath the skin. The trial didn't take long. One victim, a middle-aged female teacher, shot twice in the chest, no struggle, no signs of forced entry. The murder weapon, a handgun registered under his late father's name. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the quiet town of Avon Hill, New Hampshire. She had stayed late to grade papers. He walked in. She offered him tea. He thanked her. Then he pulled the gun from his coat pocket and shot her before she could ask why. There was no note, no confession, but the surveillance camera captured the entire act. His calm posture, the deliberate slowness of each step, the slight tilt of his head as he watched her fall. Not a trace of panic, not even a glance back as he left the room and closed the door behind him like the end of a meeting. People asked why that way. She had been his favorite, they said, his mentor, his lifeline once. So what broke? I've studied killers for over 20 years. Most leave behind a trail of pain abuse signs we missed. But Harold was different. Clean record, polite, a promising mind. So I asked myself, what makes a child become a murderer?
Not in a moment, but in a slow, silent, invisible descent.
And that's where we begin. The first sound Harold ever remembered wasn't a lullaby, but the scream of breaking glass. He was born on a Wednesday during a snowstorm that shut down most of the town. His mother, Elaine, gave birth alone. His father, Harold Sr., never made it to the hospital. They said he was at a bar across the state line. Harold III came into the world already missing someone. The house on Willow Creek Lane had peeling paint cold floors, and one rule, don't make noise after 7 p.m. That was when his father's drinking began. The walls weren't thick enough to hide the fights. The boy learned early how to stay still, to make himself smaller, quieter. He once held his breath for a full minute while hiding in the pantry just so the shouting wouldn't find him. His only companion was a teddy bear named Wilson. One night when Harold was 5, his father ripped it in half during a rage. No more baby stuff, he slurred. Harold picked up the torn bear and tried to sew it back with dental floss he stole from the bathroom. The bear never looked the same again. Neither did Harold. There were no bedtime stories, just silence punctuated by slammed doors and sharp words. His mother rarely made eye contact. She moved like a ghost, distant, efficient, exhausted. Children need warmth, need to be seen. Harold learned instead how to disappear. He became a shadow in his own home, watching, listening, storing every sound. And on one night, the one that changed everything, he heard something different, the sound of dishes crashing followed by a door locking from the outside. His mother had locked herself in the bedroom. His father had left, and Harold was alone in the kitchen crying next to the torn teddy bear, waiting for someone to open the door. That was the first time the world told him, you're on your own now. In school he learned that being invisible at home was nothing compared to being ignored by the world. Harold didn't speak much in class. His voice was soft, hesitant, as if he were testing the air for danger before releasing a word. Teachers described him as polite but distant. He sat at the back, never raised his hand, and often stared too long at things no one else noticed, like the ticking second hand on the classroom clock or the way sunlight hit the chalk dust. At recess, he wandered the fence line. He once told a teacher he liked the way the rust made patterns. The teacher nodded and forgot the comment 5 minutes later. The other kids didn't forget. They called him Creep Shadow Dummy Harold. He wore the same sweater 3 days in a row and smelled like the smoke his father exhaled. No one sat next to him at lunch. One time a boy knocked over his tray on purpose. Harold just stood there staring down at the spaghetti spilled across the floor. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply bent down piece by piece and picked it up. Not because he was used to humiliation, but because it was familiar. He tried once to make a friend, a girl who let him borrow a pencil. The next day he brought her a small drawing he made of a cat. She smiled, but by lunchtime her friends had torn it to pieces. Harold watched from across the room, holding a second drawing behind his back, the one he never gave her. At home no one asked about his day. At school no one remembered his name. The world had spoken, you don't belong here. And something in him whispered back, then I'll make a place where I do. The mirror began to crack when Harold looked into it and saw someone even he didn't recognize. Puberty didn't hit Harold like a wave. It came like a slow leak, quiet, strange, and unsettling. His voice deepened, his shoulders broadened, but his eyes, they stayed the same, alert, wounded, watchful. He started talking to himself in the bathroom mirror, whispered things like, "Don't be weak and they don't matter." When he was caught muttering in class, the counselor suggested more group time. Harold nodded, then skipped the next session. He stole a pair of scissors once from the art room, not because he needed them, but because he could. Holding them gave him a rush, power sharp and cold. He didn't use them, just kept them under his bed, wrapped in an old sock. Control felt better than comfort. He lied to his teachers about finishing assignments, about where he was during lunch. One day when his homeroom teacher accused him of cheating, he looked her dead in the eye and said calmly, "You're wrong." No emotion, just conviction. And she backed down. The voice inside him grew louder, sometimes angry, sometimes afraid, but always demanding. "They don't care about you, so stop caring about them."
And then came the fire.
Not literal, but a sudden outburst. A boy shoved him in the hallway. Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he shoved back hard. The boy hit the lockers. Everyone turned to stare. And Harold smiled. He wasn't smiling at the boy. He was smiling at the feeling like something had clicked into place. A new version of himself, one that could survive. But afterward, alone in the bathroom, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize his face. That was the day the mask started forming, and Harold didn't stop it. He learned how to charm, how to blend in, how to look just like everyone else while hiding everything. By the time Harold turned 22, he had mastered the art of passing as normal, as kind, as trustworthy. The kind of man who holds the elevator door, remembers birthdays, smiles on cue. He got a job at a small local tech firm, nothing glamorous but stable. He brought donuts on Fridays, laughed at the right moments, even made small talk about weather and football, though he didn't care for either.
His co-workers called him Landon, a name he liked better than Harold. It sounded clean, sharp, unattached to the boy with the torn teddy bear.
He even fell in love or something close to it. Her name was Emily, a co-worker with tired eyes and a crooked smile. They dated for 6 months. She once said, "You're the safest person I know." He smiled back, but inside there was nothing. No warmth, no echo of her words. Just a voice saying, "You're doing it." They believe it. At night when he was alone, he practiced his facial expressions in the mirror. He made himself cry without feeling. He taught himself to frown in perfect sympathy. He could mimic concern, joy, even fear. But it was all technique, all surface.
The truth, he didn't know who he was anymore, or if anyone had ever truly known him to begin with. He was not a monster, but he was not alive either. Just functioning.
And sometimes, late at night, he'd stare at the ceiling and wonder, does anyone see the person I've buried beneath all this pretending? The mask was sturdy until the final betrayal cracked it open, and something inside Harold snapped. It started small. A shift in tone. A glance that lingered too long. Emily, the woman who once said he was her safest person, began pulling away. She canceled plans, answered messages late, laughed too loudly with a man from accounting. Harold noticed everything but said nothing. Then came the night she told him, "You're great, really, but I need something more." Something more. She didn't mean it to wound him. But it did. Not because he loved her, but because she was the last thread, the final illusion that someone somewhere might truly see him and stay. After she left, something in Harold changed. Not suddenly, but steadily. He stopped bringing donuts to work, stopped returning texts. He sat in silence at meetings, eyes fixed on nothing. His manager joked, "You look like a ghost." Harold smiled, but not with his eyes. Then one day he saw her, his former teacher, Ms. Alden, the only adult who ever paused long enough to ask, "Are you okay?" She was walking across the library parking lot carrying a paper bag of books. Gray hair, slower steps, but the same soft face. Memories flooded him, her voice, her warmth, the time she waited with him after school because his mother forgot again. She had touched his shoulder once and said, "You matter, Harold. even if no one tells you that. And suddenly he hated her, because she had seen him and then disappeared like the rest. In his mind, the betrayal bloomed. She knew, and she left me anyway. That night, Harold sat in his apartment, the lights off, staring at an old photo of her. His hand rested on the cold metal of a gun. The first time I saw his eyes empty, it wasn't rage, it was silence. A silence that had been waiting its turn.
He didn't shout, didn't tremble. He just walked in and did what he thought would finally make the silence stop.
It was a Tuesday. The sky was gray, the air damp with the threat of rain. Ms. Alden had stayed after school to grade papers like she always did. Her classroom was warm, filled with books, and the faint smell of coffee. Harold knew the place well. He had sat at those desks, listened to her voice, once felt safe there. He walked in through the side door. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled. "Harold, is that you?"
He nodded.
She stood. "It's been years. You look well. Would you like some tea?" He said nothing, just took a few slow steps forward. She tilted her head, reading the silence.
"You okay, sweetheart?"
That word, sweetheart, landed like a stone. Too late. Too soft. It didn't erase the years he waited for someone to knock on his door to ask how he was to notice.
And now she noticed now.
His hand slipped into his coat pocket. Cold metal, firm grip, no tremor.
He raised the gun.
Ms. Alden froze. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She only whispered, "Harold, why?" And he said calmly, "Because you left." 2 shots, both to the chest, clean, deliberate, controlled. She fell without a sound, papers scattering around her like snow.
He stood there for a moment watching, breathing in the silence. And then something strange happened.
He smiled.
Not in joy, not in triumph, but in release. Like for once the voice inside him had stopped screaming. Like for the first time in years, he felt something.
Control, power, stillness. And when he turned and walked away, he didn't look back. Because there was nothing left to see. What does a killer feel the morning after guilt relief, or nothing at all? Harold woke up the next day like it was any other morning. The sun crept through the blinds, the floor cold beneath his feet. He made coffee, toasted a slice of bread, buttered it. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't have to.
He already knew what they'd say. Tragic, shocking, beloved teacher taken too soon. They would show her picture, one she hated, taken at a school function. They would say her name too many times and his not enough.
Harold didn't run, didn't hide. He went to work. His co-workers noticed something was different. He was lighter. His shoulders sat lower, his voice calm. A woman in HR even said, "You look rested." He smiled. Inside, though, it wasn't peace, it was emptiness. Not the loud, aching kind, but a quiet vacancy. Like all the noise had been drained, and now there was just space. That night he walked home slowly, stopped by the same corner store, bought milk, paid an exact change. On the way back he passed the school. Police tape flapped in the wind. He paused.
No fear, no rush of regret, just curiosity, like a man staring at the ruins of a house he once lived in.
He didn't feel evil. He didn't feel free. He just felt done. And then somewhere between the streetlight and his front door, a strange thought surfaced. If they knew what it felt like to be unseen for that long, they'd understand. And for the first time in his life, Harold didn't feel invisible. He felt real.
But reality has a way of knocking on doors, and this time it came wearing a badge.
They found him 3 days later, not because he confessed, not because he fled, but because Harold Francis Landon III was never truly hidden. Surveillance caught his face. His name was on old staff records. Someone remembered the quiet boy with sharp eyes and long silences. He opened the door without hesitation, no panic, no fight, just opened it and said, "You've been looking for me." The arrest was silent. He didn't resist, didn't speak on the way to the station, just stared out the window watching trees blur by. At the station, they asked the usual questions. Why her? Why now? Do you feel remorse? He looked at them and said, "I don't feel anything."
They thought it was coldness. Maybe it was, but I've seen enough to know better.
It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from wearing a mask for too long.
In his cell, he sat still for hours. Didn't ask for books, or a lawyer, or even food. Just stared at the floor, the wall, the door, like each held a piece of something he had lost long ago.
And when they finally brought in a therapist, she asked the question most were afraid to ask, "Who are you when no one's watching?" Harold didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "I don't know."
And for the first time, his expression changed. Not rage, not pride, not even grief.
Just the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who had finally removed the last layer of his disguise. Not a demon, not a monster, just a frightened boy in the body of a man who killed. The last lesson he left behind, one we keep forgetting again and again. Harold Francis Landon III sits behind bars now. No appeals, no headlines. The story faded as stories do. Another tragedy filed away in the public's mind, neatly labeled "never understood." But I can't forget him. Not because of what he did, but because of what we didn't do. No one becomes a killer overnight. It doesn't begin with a weapon. It begins in silence. In the quiet moments when a child cries without comfort, speaks without being heard, disappears while sitting in plain sight. Harold didn't kill because of rage. He killed because somewhere along the line he stopped believing the world could see him any other way.
And what's worse,
He may have been right. What if someone had truly listened back then? Not just heard his words, but understood his pain. Would Ms. Alden still be alive? Would Harold?
We can never answer that, but we can ask it over and over until the next silent child is seen.
We love stories with clear villains, monsters in the dark, but sometimes the darkness grows in daylight, in hallways, in homes, in places we call safe. Harold's story isn't an excuse, it's a mirror. And if you look closely enough, it reflects not just his face, but ours. Because this crime didn't start with blood. It started with the moment the world looked away. And out there right now are others like him.
not yet killers, not yet lost, just waiting for someone to notice before it's too late.